It's time to talk about a relatively affordable 4K QD OLED monitor. That's right, we're talking about the MO32U2 from Gigabyte, which is a 4K 165Hz QD OLED with, I guess, technically a last generation QD OLED panel, although let's be honest, they're all kind of the same. And what's interesting about this display is that, well, instead of it being 240 Hertz, well, it's actually a 165 Hertz panel, which of course does mean the price is gonna be more affordable. And that's what we're looking at today because, well, look, a 4K 165 Hertz refresh rate is gonna be the sweet spot for a lot of buyers, making this very interesting. Also, real quick, this monitor was lent to me by Gigabyte, so that won't be changing my opinions. And if you're wondering, hey, who's this guy talking about monitors? What does he know? Well, I've been reviewing monitors for years now. I am the display guy. I review everything from monitors to TVs to even VR. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you get subscribed, but enough. Let's get into this review to find out if it's actually any good. All right, real quick, in terms of connectivity, pause if you need to, but do be aware it comes with two HDMI 2.1 ports and one DisplayPort 1.4, not 2.1. So yes, you may need display stream compression, but in terms of the pricing, we are talking about $789.99 and a 3-year warranty plus burn-in. So to be honest with you, that is one of the lower priced 4K 32-inch options, and if it delivers, well, this could be one of the best value options on the market today. Also, if you've never used an OLED display before, maybe you're looking at one for the first time, expect some really fast motion performance that will absolutely destroy any LCD, as well as per pixel local dimming, leading to far higher contrast. Everything is just going to look way better. Whether it's still or in motion, it's just going to look absolutely fantastic. But does the actual display itself deliver? Is it tuned well? Well, there's only one way to find out, and that's to jump into the Portrait Display CalMAN results, which, by the way, I'm a part of the reviewer program. Feel free to skip ahead if you just want the TLDR, but for everyone else, let's jump into it. So in terms of SDR out of the box, it does have a few issues as per usual. I will have the best settings for this display linked in my Patreon in the description below, which of course also gets you access to the Discord where we can pretend to be like family. But actually, after adjusting it, it's still not perfect. It seems to be, unfortunately, raising some shadow detail in SDR. However, other than that, every single other aspect is actually incredibly accurate for a display like this. Likewise, when you take a look at the color checker analysis, you can see it also does pretty good in average delta E of 1.4. You're unlikely to notice any major errors. Now, in terms of the HDR, well, the default HDR, it's pretty good. It does have some crushed shadow detail at the very bottom, but otherwise it's not too bad. In the peak 1000 mode, well, it's basically unusable in terms of accuracy. Also, for the color checker analysis for HDR, it's also surprisingly pretty decent with an average delta E of 5.2. That's actually not too bad. And then for the BT 2020 coverage, I got 77.76%. It's actually a bit lower than I was expecting, so I'm not sure what's going on here, but look, that's what I got. So the TLDR, honestly, this does have surprisingly good accuracy for how much of a value display, quote unquote, it is at $789 roughly. In fact, I was surprised to see both in SDR as well as HDR, the appropriate modes do track very well with only some minor shadow crush in HDR at the very bottom, as well as unfortunately raised shadow detail for the SDR mode, which hopefully can be fixed with a firmware update, but don't hold your breath. Otherwise though, in terms of color accuracy and everything else, it actually all is much better than I was expecting and one of the better results that I've seen. But what about HDR itself in terms of impact? And here's what I'll tell you. Look, if you're expecting this thing to be way better than any other QD OLED, it's not. And it's also not going to be dethroning TVs or anything like that. However, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be using HDR. I still would definitely use HDR on this monitor. It is going to be better. Now, in terms of the window brightness, it does land, you know, look, it's a QD OLED just like any other. It's kind of near the bottom of the pack in terms of HDR displays that I've reviewed. And you can see the LG G5 55-inch TV it's like 5 times brighter. So look, we really do need brighter monitors, but for what it is in a dark room, it'll certainly get the job done. You can see pretty similar results in the Baldur's Gate 3 real HDR brightness test at the D65 white point. It's also not super impressive here either. What's also not super impressive is unfortunately the contrast in a bright room. You can see here that 32-inch 4K glossy QD OLEDs do actually perform the worst in a bright room out of any display that I have measured so far. And when you compare them to glossy WOLED, yeah, those certainly do perform a lot better in a bright room. So you will want to have this in a light controlled room unless you want to deal with raised shadow detail, a purple looking screen, or sometimes gray as well. But let's move on to honestly what you're probably buying this for, and that's going to be gaming. And thankfully here, this is an OLED. It's 165 Hertz, which means it's awesome. I mean, everything in motion looks so clear in comparison to mini LED or LCD. It's just an absolute blowout, and it feels fantastic to play your games on. This is just such a great experience. And in terms of the actual latency of this unit, it's certainly performing about as well as you would expect. 27 milliseconds of total system latency puts it around the middle of the pack. However, do be aware this is in comparison to all the very fastest displays that I have ever tested, basically, so very respectable results there. And also in terms of the UFO test, while it's not as good as a 500 Hertz QD OLED or even a 240 Hertz QD OLED, it is very respectable. I do think it looks pretty good in motion, and for most buyers, I feel like 165 Hertz is actually the sweet spot. Does it look better past 165 Hertz? Yes. However, 165, it's pretty clear, and I think most people will be pretty happy with that, and a lot of hardware can achieve 165, whereas 240 Hertz and beyond at 4K can become quite difficult, so do keep that in mind. Now, in terms of the features, pause if you need to. Here's all of them. However, there's a ton. And the one I do want to talk about is that you can shrink the screen and run a lower resolution if you like playing your games with binoculars. However, do be aware, I couldn't get G-Sync working when I did that. Now, in terms of the text clarity and subpixel layout, it's just like any other QD OLED, which means it's not perfect, but at a 4K resolution, it's not bad either. But do be aware you will likely spot some fringing on the edges of text. Hopefully this can be fixed in the future, but I didn't find it to be too distracting. Now, in terms of the finish on the display itself, it is using a glossy coating, which means you are gonna get really, really crisp and excellent looking images overall. So while the subpixel arrangement itself isn't perfect, you will actually get a far better and far clearer image versus a perfect RGB subpixel arrangement on a matte LCD. So if you're worried about that, do be aware, yes, there's a hit to text clarity, but the overall clarity is actually really, really good and a huge step up over a 4K LCD or mini LED. It's just gonna look a lot better because those unfortunately are only available in a matte coating, which is gonna diffuse reflections. Yes, you'll see direct reflections with a glossy coating. However, the benefits to contrast and clarity are absolutely massive, and it's so worth it. It's probably the biggest upgrade you'll ever get with a display like this. It's an even larger upgrade in my opinion than the 4K resolution when it comes to clarity. Now, in terms of the viewing angles and uniformity, this is a QD OLED. It's tried and true, and I had absolutely no issues. It's basically perfect, so let's move on. Sound, if you're feeling brave, give it a try. Let's move on. Now, I did have one issue with the HDR, and unfortunately, a lot of HDR content I played did have some blown out HDR highlights, despite the fact that it wasn't having too many issues in my CalMAN testing. That's why I do both CalMAN testing as well as real world testing, as sometimes they can differ a bit. And yes, unfortunately, this did a little bit worse than I was expecting in terms of accuracy in some real world content. Hopefully that can be adjusted by Gigabyte in the future, but again, don't hold your breath. The menu and firmware itself, I thought was pretty good overall. It was pretty snappy and easy to navigate. And in terms of VRR flicker, does it have it? It's an OLED, so yes, it does have a little bit of VRR flicker, especially in dark scenes with inconsistent frame rates. It can happen. But as a whole, look, this is one of those OLEDs that at the price that it's coming in at, you're getting a whole lot for your money. I mean, especially if you're used to an LCD display, this is such a massive jump in clarity, motion performance, contrast. Every single aspect of this display is really good. And honestly, I didn't even talk about this, but I should have. The actual design of the display itself, especially the stand, which appears to be just like fully metal and just feels awesome. It's such a great design and it looks fantastic. So this is really a fantastic monitor. It's not perfect. It could certainly be brighter. It could certainly fix some of those blown out HDR highlights that I was seeing. And yes, some people will want a DisplayPort 2.1, but for what it is, it's honestly a lot more accurate than I was expecting. It's certainly fast enough at 165 Hertz, and I think most people will be very, very happy with this display. And so for those reasons, I'm gonna give it a solid 8 out of 10. definitely highly recommended. And I'll have some affiliate links in the description below if you want to pick one up for yourself. They actually are available right now, and it's worth taking a look to see if there's any discounts going on. You never know, but certainly a great monitor from Gigabyte that actually surprised me. And for everything else display related, make sure you get subscribed here on The Display Guy.